We're live, all right. Welcome everybody to Zandbroz. We're glad to have you here this afternoon. This is, I think, maybe our third NDSU Humanities Colloquium. I love that word, colloquium. And we're pleased to have you here today. And I'm going to turn it over to our official introducer, Heath Wing. Come on up,
Thank you.
Heath.
Oh, okay. Thank you.
You bet.
And first, if we could give Greg a round of applause. He's for letting us use this space. When Tom first approached me about doing a Humanities Colloquium, this was a little over a year ago, we thought it would be a good idea to do it somewhere off campus instead of on campus, and the first place that came to mind was Zandbroz, and yeah, we've always been able to do it here, which is always, it's very nice. So I am going to introduce our speaker for this evening, and also, and the other folks I need to thank are all of y'all, right? So just give yourself a little pat on the back. Thank you for coming. I appreciate it. Thank you for supporting humanities. And I'm sure that extra credit was no motivating factor for anyone here, right? No, not at all. So, not for you, Sean. Sorry. So I'm going to introduce Don here.
You can introduce Sean first.
So Dr. Don Johnson received his PhD at Northwestern University. He has been a professor of history here at NDSU since 2015. And so Don specializes in the Revolution era history of the United States. His book, Occupied America, Military Rule, and the Everyday Experience of Revolution, he published with the University of Pennsylvania Press in 2020. You won several awards for that as well?
Just two.
Just two awards. I'll get to your awards section in a minute. He's also published multiple articles and book chapters, quite a few reviews as well. He's very involved with his scholarship. He has also earned a number of fellowships and grants that I'm not going to go into with those, but I will mention your awards for your book, which, correct me if I'm wrong. I believe the Society for Military History of Distinguished Book Award was one of them that you received in 2021. And the other award, was that the Harry M. Ward Book Award that you also won for your book as well? So Don, as you can tell, sent me his CV, so I'm cherry picking from it here on my phone.
You asked me for a bio 2 hours ago.
Okay. Yes. We at the Humanities Colloquium pride ourselves in being very prepared and organized. So yeah, I asked him for his bio 2 hours ago. He sent me his CV. Don is a wonderful scholar and a really good friend, so I'm pleased to now turn the time over to you for your presentation, which is your title?
The Popular Politics of American Independence.
Thank you.
Which is a mouthful. So, thank you all for coming, and thanks especially to Tom and Heath for convening this colloquium, which is been a really nice breath of fresh air after a couple of years of pandemic angst and kind of university drama. It's kind of nice to have one of this kind of a setting to talk about the stuff that we actually really do and really like and really are passionate about. So thanks also to Zandbroz for giving us this wonderful space. As we said, as I was telling Tom and Heath, as we were all kind of gathering, it's the first time kind of in a while that I felt kind of back in the swing of kind of the culture of the humanities, in addition to kind of what we do at the university. So I'm going to talk today about a book project that is kind of coming into kind of crystallization just towards the end of this year. It's a book I've been researching for about 4 years, since roughly kind of mid-2019, and that I started conceptualizing a little earlier as I was finishing my first book on military occupation. And it aims to investigate the popular movement at the heart of the American founding. And that's kind of the title, The Popular Politics of American Independence, kind of comes from that. The focus on kind of local and popular political events rather than things going on at higher levels. A lot of our perceptions of the American Revolution revolve around institutions like the Continental Congress, the Continental Army, the state provincial conventions, and the state constitutions. But in the period between April 1775 and July 1776, and I'll get into why this is an important kind of space in a moment, it was ordinary men and women in their local communities, in small towns, in rural counties, and even in larger cities, who took the initiative. They rallied neighbors, friends, and relatives. They toppled royal governments that they had supported for most of them their entire lives. And in a burst of revolutionary fervor, they replaced colonial governors and colonial administrations with local leaders, with people from their communities. And these local leaders created kind of ad hoc civil administrations. And again, this is in the absence of a formal kind of state or a formal instructions by any legitimating body. And we'll get into kind of how they assess their legitimacy as well. But they took the form of kind of ad hoc committees, known alternately as committees of safety, committees of inspection, committees of correspondence. They sometimes get really kind of Byzantine names like committees for the detection and suppression of conspiracies. Really kind of like these committees, which were comprised of local farmers, merchants, clergy, artisans, professionals. And in the kind of interregnum period between the outbreak of the War of the Revolution in April of 1775 and the adoption of formal independence and the creation of a new nation in July of 1776, and again, I want to stress that this is more than a year that these people are kind of operating mostly on their own with very little guidance. They proved remarkably effective, not only at mobilizing for the war, and this was their primary task, kind of defending their regions and mobilizing soldiers for the Revolutionary War, but also at kind of more mundane tasks of municipal government, dispensing justice, administering taxation, and other kind of tasks that you would generally look to a local government for. And in this sense, while the Continental Congress and elites at the state and colony level struggled to take charge of the unfolding revolution, and then these people are kind of divided between themselves, between moderates and conservatives and radicals about whether independence is a goal, whether there should be armed struggle, whether there should be some kind of political settlement. This is all well documented in the works of people like Pauline Maier, Gordon Wood, and some other historians that those who have looked at this period at all will be familiar with. These ordinary people busied themselves in establishing what was a de facto independence. So when their representatives in Congress finally got with the program and declared independence in June and July of 1776, they were not just kind of creating a new nation state, but also formalizing an already existing state of affairs that prevailed over much of British North America. And in fact, by early 1776, these committeemen in local places, and I'm going to talk about 3 different kind of county committees and 3 different colonies in this talk, soon became the vanguard in the movement for independence. Months of often frustrating experience managing chaotic communities, balancing the needs of warfighting with the expectations of justice and equality that came with the revolutionary rhetoric they supported, and mediating between loyalists, people who remained loyal to the king, moderates who kind of weren't sure about that revolution was a good idea, and radicals who were ready to go and kill the first British soldier they could find. Moderating between these demands convinced many local leaders that national independence was needed, and a legal and constitutional order that would necessarily follow was the only way to kind of make permanent these independent regimes. Thus, they recognized their shortcomings and failures, and this is not a story of local elites kind of jealously guarding their regional autonomy, as we've kind of come to expect in a lot of other situations. Rather, these committees pushed for increased authority at the state and national level in order to legitimate their own rule, ensure the well-being of their communities, and ensure the success of the revolutionary cause. Now, the myriad local revolutions, and these really were local revolutions that took place kind of very much on a local scale, we'll get to that later on, that laid the groundwork for American independence, these find little resonance in most modern histories of the Revolutionary era. And a major reason for this omission is that the popular movement that took hold in communities across British North America sidelined many of the long-standing leaders of the resistance against Great Britain. People like Samuel Adams, John Dickinson, William Henry Lee, these kind of revolutionaries or resistance leaders from the 1760s and early 1770s. And most of these, again, as I said, kind of continued to advocate moderation, patience, and conciliation, although the Adamses are an outlier there. But almost immediately after the commencement of hostilities at Lexington and Concord on April 19th of 1775, revolutionary committees outstripped the tenuous authority granted them by the Congress and ultimately flouted, ignored, or expanded directives from those claiming power at the national and state level. Thus, not until the spring and summer of 1776, after independence, did the elite revolutionaries regain control over the movement. After independence, state constitutions replaced these rough-hewn popular regimes with formal structures of representation, state legislatures, state judiciaries, etc., state governors. And the Articles of Confederation in 1777, and then when it's ratified in 1779, 1780, establishes Congress as the sole font of authority over the military and the diplomatic struggle for self-rule. Thus, kind of after the War of the Revolution, when wealthy and educated leaders that came to dominate these institutions began to write their history, they naturally privileged these state and national level bodies and their actions above the actions of the people kind of a rung or two below at the local towns and county levels. And as a result, most histories of American independence have privileged national over local politics, and the actions of congressmen and legislatures over those of committeemen. But there's another reason that the role of these committees has been largely overlooked, and it's a bit of a darker one. It's that they paint the revolution, at least in its early days, as a distinctly unsavory affair. These local revolutionaries imprisoned opponents without trial, impounded property, and exercised arbitrary justice. Popular leaders utilized mob tactics and intimidation against their neighbors who disagreed with violent resistance to the crown, and a culture of denunciation emerged similar to those found in other revolutionary times and places. For example, France in the 1790s or Russia in the late 1910s, early 1920s. These were areas where mere accusations of disloyalty to the new regimes were enough to condemn otherwise upstanding citizens to property confiscation, imprisonment, exile, and sometimes worse. Thus, given the irony that a revolution in the name of liberty utilized such distinctly illiberal tactics, and again, those of you familiar with other revolutions and other times and places won't be surprised by that irony. It kind of is part and parcel of the revolutionary experience. It's hardly surprising, though, that generations of scholars who are more focused on assembling a optimistic or a positive national past had not chosen to emphasize this popular side of the revolutionary movement. But by leaving out the role of popular governments that drove the revolution in its earlier days, I argue that we've only told half the story of the establishment of the United States. And the book that I'm trying to write, hopefully to come out around 2026, restores the story of these first revolutionary regimes and the men and women who created and sustained them. So I'm going to kind of now go into some examples of who these committee men were, what they were doing throughout 1775 and 1776. And I'm going to focus primarily on 3 counties, which I've highlighted on your handouts here. I hope those are legible. And by the way, just before I go into that, a sense of kind of the demographics of early British North America. I know the black and white kind of has obfuscated a little bit of the distribution on your maps. The population of British North America was about 2.5 million at the time of the Revolution in 1775. 2.5 million European descended people who were mostly English, German, Scots, Irish descended people who were Protestant and mostly came from either southwestern Scotland or the province of Ulster in Ireland, Scottish, and from a number of countries in kind of northern and western Europe. There's also about 500,000 enslaved people living mostly in Virginia and South, but with substantial numbers in New York and Pennsylvania, even in Massachusetts and Rhode Island and some places in New England, along with perhaps 100,000 Native Americans who lived kind of in what we'll call kind of the area of settlement. And one of the things I like about this map is it gives you not just the theoretical colony borders, but the kind of shaded areas show you exactly kind of how far that settlement had reached. And as a general kind of standard, the further west you get, the more Native Americans are still there. There were people by 1775 who were born and raised in places like New York and Philadelphia or Boston, who likely had never met a Native American, whereas further west they make up to kind of half or more of the population. So these 3 counties I'm looking at, a little bit, I'm looking at these 3 for a couple of reasons. First of all, in the terms of Tryon County, New York, and Lancaster County, Pennsylvania, these have some of the best records for these county committees. And these can be hard to find. There's a smattering of a few dozen of them throughout the colonies, but because they were fundamentally extra-legal bodies engaged in insurrection, a lot of people weren't eager to kind of keep notes and deal them out. To paraphrase Stringer Bell from The Wire, one doesn't keep notes on a criminal conspiracy. So Tryon County, Lancaster County have some of the best remaining sources. The minutes of these committees are relatively complete from the end of 1774 through the end of 1775, and in Lancaster's case, even beyond into 1776. Dunmore County, Virginia has records. They're not quite as robust, but I just found them 2 months ago at an archive trip in Virginia, and I'm kind of excited about them, so I decided to include that as well. And there are also kind of 3 different types of counties that existed in colonial North America. Tryon County, New York, is founded pretty late in 1772, named after William Tryon, the then British governor of New York, and it's a massive county. To give you a sense of this, it contains all or part of 15 current counties in central and western New York, and it ranges from the Canadian border all the way south to around Albany, or even a little bit further south than that. The Albany is to the east of that in its own jurisdiction. Population is largely recently settled and dominated not by English but by Scots-Irish settlers and German settlers. And this is typical of New York and Pennsylvania around this time. One historian's estimated around 100,000 people from Scotland and Ireland, and another 50 to 75,000 people from Western and Central Germany are immigrating every year during the 1760s and 1770s. And a lot of them are ending up in the western parts of New York, Pennsylvania, Virginia, and further south. It's also one where Native Americans are still a massive presence. It borders directly on the Iroquois Confederacy. And the population, we think, is around 10,000 European-descended people and about 10,000 Native Americans, so roughly equal. Lancaster County in Pennsylvania is fundamentally different. It's a settled community. It's one where most people are born into that community rather than have come more recently. It's dominated by Lancaster Township, which at 3,000 people was the second largest town in Pennsylvania in 1776. And it also contains a number of smaller townships, the most prominent one being the town of Paxton, which was the center of a spout of anti-Indian violence during 1763 and 1764, and a notorious massacre of peaceful Conestoga Indians. Its population is largely made up of English Quakers, Scots-Irish of various denominations, and Germans who came to Pennsylvania largely because of its religious toleration, and many of these were members of different religious sects that were persecuted in Europe. So, for example, Moravians, Mennonites, the United Evangelical Brethren, who I believe, Dr. Blankenship isn't here, she could tell you, are kind of a precursor of the modern-day Amish, who have a huge presence in Lancaster County. And it's a significantly more populous county in terms of total population. There's about 30,000 European and European-descended people living in the region, as well as in terms of settlement. There's only about 1,000 Native Americans, we think, kind of living in the area, and the massacres of the 1760s have a lot to do with that. And then Dunmore County is the smallest. It's another kind of frontier county, but unlike Tryon County, it's not on kind of the edge of the frontier. It's a little bit kind of behind the lines. And it operates a little bit as a transit port. A lot of the kind of population of Dunmore County, which is in western Virginia, doesn't stay there long. A lot of them are kind of waiting on land claims further west in the Ohio Valley, or in modern-day Kentucky, which was then part of Virginia's charter, or kind of using the region to trade furs with the Native Americans in order to make money and go further east. The population is mostly Scots-Irish, German, and Shawnee, and about 8,000 total people, Native Americans and European combined. And I haven't kind of nailed, as I've only recently kind of started researching Dunmore County, I haven't nailed down the exact kind of ratio there, but I would imagine kind of 2/3 European, 1/3 Native, kind of think of that. There's a strong Native presence in the Shenandoah Valley. So these committees emerged in most colonies and most towns and counties at the end of 1774, and they're at the behest of the First Continental Congress. And the First Continental Congress is this first kind of unified body to respond to provocations or perceived provocations by the British government on the rights, the constitutional rights of Americans, American colonists. And many of these, the first time they meet is to actually select representatives to the Congress or to the conventions in the colonies that then sent people to the Congress. So they meet, a lot of them in kind of June and August of 1774. The Congress meets in September and October. And then even more are formed after the Congress publishes its reports, which call for a boycott of British goods, and kind of a non-importation pact known as the Association. And the Association, in order to enforce this kind of economic warfare, instructs that, quote, a committee be chosen in every county, city, and town by qualified voters, though again it doesn't say who's exactly qualified, and this differs widely among states and even between counties in different provinces. And that each committee was responsible for, quote, observing the conduct of all persons touching the association. So they're essentially supposed to ferret out who's selling tea illegally and do something about them, though exactly what they're supposed to do about them is left unclear. They're instructed to publish the names of people who violate the association, to be, quote, universally condemned as enemies of American liberty. But they're not really given great instructions beyond that. So it's, enforce the boycott, select yourselves based on some roughly kind of electoral process, publish the names of violators and try to get them to stop violating the boycott, but we'll leave the details up to you guys. And perhaps because of the tentativeness of the Congress itself, these decisions are left almost entirely to the interpretation of local leaders. Now, they're also subject to the orders occasionally of provincial assemblies and conventions. So again, here, the line of authority is even more tenuous because these provincial assemblies and conventions are operating by early 1775 largely in contravention of British governors who are attempting to dissolve them. And these provincial conventions don't really deal with committees very much. Pennsylvania's provincial convention in January of 1775 mentions local committees very, very briefly, just instructing them to aid one another in enforcing the association and encouraging local manufacturing. And in Virginia in March of 75, the Virginia Convention recommends that local committees begin collecting, quote, contributions for supplying the necessities and alleviating the distresses of our brave and worthy fellow subjects of Boston. So collecting charity for the people of Boston who are shut down in terms of their economic livelihoods by British measures. And to, quote, take effectual measures for the procuring of gunpowder, lead, flints, and cartridge paper. So there's this kind of hint that something more radical is in the works. They're kind of supposed to arm themselves, but there's no sense of why or how they're supposed to pay for those arms or what their actual authority over their communities is. And as a result of this lack of instructions, the committees that formed, especially in early 1775, had a distinctly local character. And they comprised a mix of men of different backgrounds and different professions who represented roughly kind of the worthies of their respective regions. And just a caveat here, these were leading men in their own communities, but they were by and large men of only local importance. They were kind of proverbial small fish or big fish in small ponds. They mostly lacked the resources, connections, or ambitions to rise further in provincial or imperial politics. They were not the type of people who were going to be appointed to high office. They were not the type of people, in most cases, who were going to be elected to the legislature. They were kind of the local leaders, the local kind of elite. They were rung below these other people. To give you some examples, Lancaster County's committee. The county committee had about 11 to 12 members who showed up at its various meetings, and they ranged from kind of the highest member of the committee in terms of social status, Edward Shippen III, who was in his 70s at the time, a semi-retired judge in the region. He had held high office in the county and in Pennsylvania for about 3 decades before the 1770s, chairs the committee for much of early 1775 and kind of this older, venerable leader. Also includes younger people, up-and-coming young lawyers like Jasper Yates and George Ross, the latter of whom actually goes on to become a congressional delegate and sign the Declaration of Independence. People in the professions, a physician in the town of Lancaster by the name of Adam Simon Kuhn, a dyer and assistant Burgess, a member of the town council, named Caspar Schaffner, even down to an innkeeper, Adam Reigart, whose tavern provided the meeting place for the committee throughout its first year of existence. So we've got everyone from the retired judge, who's kind of the local sage, to the tavern keeper, who kind of keeps order among the drunks. Most of these come from the borough of Lancaster, though a few, such as Militia Colonel James Byrd of Paxton, do represent outlying townships, and often kind of chaired smaller town-level committees that periodically met to kind of carry out the will of the county committee. So there's this kind of hierarchy within these areas as well. In Tryon County, we get kind of a bit of a similar situation, though a much more kind of militaristic bent, given its frontier location and recent settlement. As well as a faction of clergy that are put on, and it's actually chaired by the Lutheran minister Peter Muhlenberg. It's Dunmore County, chaired by the Lutheran minister Peter Muhlenberg. And its membership tends to be younger. Again, Dunmore County is more recently settled. These are people who are coming west to make their fortunes. A typical example is 25-year-old lawyer-ish, if you don't look too closely, Jonathan Clark. And what I mean by that is Clark had not received legal education per se. He had not gone to college to become a lawyer, and the College of William and Mary back in Eastern Virginia was where he would go. His neighbor growing up in Albemarle County, a young man by the name of Thomas Jefferson, had a little bit more money about this and did do so. Clark rather got a job as a clerk to the county court, rode circuit with the judges, and eventually kind of opened a practice as what we might think of as a country lawyer, someone who doesn't have the credential but practices law anyway, and is a member of the bar in Western Virginia. He becomes kind of the clerk, the note taker of the committee. There's also kind of ordinary farmers. So a man by the name of Henry Funk, who I've been working on kind of tracking down a little bit, owned about 100 acres of land in the county and a little bit more to the west in Ohio and Kentucky, in areas that were still occupied by the Native Americans, so he couldn't exactly go out and farm it. At 21 years old, recently married, which signified he was kind of ready to financially support a family, was what we might think of as kind of a small farmholder, and 100 acres of land in that region kind of puts you about in the middle area for people who owned their own land. Then Tryon County in New York has this kind of militaristic bent to it, and again, a lot of veterans of the French and Indian War, which crossed the Canadian border multiple times and involved heavy fighting in that region. Its chair is Nicholas Herkimer, 47 years old and born to German immigrants. He's a wealthy farmer. He enslaved as many as 33 people at his estate through his lifetime, though not all at the same time. He probably only had between a dozen and 15 at one point. Though again, this puts him kind of in the top 10%, maybe even top 5% of New York farmers. He was also a militia captain, served in the French and Indian War, and spoke Mohawk, German, and English with varying degrees of fluency, which was pretty common in the region that had a lot of different cultures mingling. Duncan McDougall, another kind of person further down, was a merchant. He's either Scots-Irish or Scottish, I can't quite tell which, who moves to the county once it's established in 1772 and sets up a profitable fur trading business. And then another kind of representative example is Augustinius Hess. 57, was one of the oldest members of the committee, and contrast that to Lancaster, where the chair is in his 70s. 57 was kind of an old man on the frontier here. Hess had himself immigrated when he was about 4 years old in a batch of Palatine immigrants who had split up about 10,000 acres into 100-acre plots, which Augustinius inherited one. And I haven't been able to find exactly what he owned or what his economic status was, but by 1775 he supported 5 children and a wife in a manner that was respectable enough to be called Mr., which was not everyone got in the 18th century. So the activities that these committees got to in 1775 and early 1776, well, their first duties were the enforcement of the Continental Association, this widespread boycott of tea that was imported from Great Britain, from the East India Company, as well as kind of all other goods imported from Great Britain. And we get the idea of these committees kind of widely interpreting the instructions of the Congress and of their provincial assemblies. So in Lancaster, in as early as August of 1774, the members of the committee investigated a shopkeeper suspected of selling tea that had, quote, paid duty under the late Act of Parliament, and this was a key distinction. Smuggled tea was fine because it was illegal. Tea that had paid taxes was to be impounded because the point is to economically hurt Great Britain. And, didn't find anything conclusive, didn't find that they had authority to do anything to it. But by January of 1775, they're beginning to more rigorously enforce these new orders. They shut down the school of a local dancing master because the Congress has forbidden, quote, expensive diversions and entertainments. And in March, they force a merchant found in violation of non-importation to publicly recant his actions and, quote, adhere inviolably to the Association of the American Continental Congress. And the minutes and the records of these committees don't go into great detail about how they did this, but from other sources and from other accounts, it's clear that there was some degree of kind of physical intimidation. They might kind of come to these people's houses with clubs or with muskets and kind of say, hey, you've got a nice tea shop here. It'd be a shame if something happened to it. Why don't you sign on to this association? Things like this and kind of that kind of community peer pressure. And again, this is a local story. In Dunmore County, the committee in February of 1775 investigated a case of a Mr. William Holliday. And this is, again, it gets kind of to the ambiguities and local character of this. Holliday had apparently entered the county earlier that year from neighboring Frederick County, had run into trouble with that county's committee for selling tea that had paid taxes, now is in Dunmore County, claims now that it's smuggled tea and so it's fine, and actually that he's heading on further west and just selling a little bit of tea in the county, so maybe they could let him go. So you get a sense of kind of this spectrum. And in Tryon County, there's no enforcement of the association whatsoever. In fact, the committee doesn't even meet from August of 74 to May of 1775. So it's this kind of, we're not going to bother with any of this. After April of 1775, things changed, and the primary function of the committees came to be military preparedness, preparing and really kind of channeling the armed volunteers that are turning out in response to news of the outbreak of violence at Lexington and Concord. And this, David Hackett Fisher has a great book about this where he traces kind of the speed of the news. It gets from Massachusetts to Georgia in the space of about 2 months, which is shockingly fast for 18th century North America. It even, it gets down to Pennsylvania within 2 weeks of the actions. The Lancaster Committee meets on May 1st, already having been briefed on the events in Massachusetts. They resolve to, quote, defend and protect the religious and civil rights of this and our sister colonies, pledge to use the utmost diligence to acquaint ourselves with military discipline and the art of war, and immediately order the formation of volunteer military companies of about 100 men each. 2 days later, they resolved to examine the quantity of powder and lead in the respective townships, forbid shopkeepers from selling ammunition without, quote, having a license from 2 members of the committee. And then they go further, compelling several merchants to sell their powder directly to the committee at prices set by its agents. So you see already kind of taking on more authority than is anticipated by either the Congress, the state assemblies, or that they have kind of any legitimate legal claim to, other than being kind of the local leaders of their community. And as couched in the records of those agreements, there's little doubts that these were forced sales, and they're intended to add to the committee's growing stockpile of ammunition and prevent that material from falling into the hands of potential enemies of the revolutionary movement. In Dunmore County, there's similar measures being taken. There's a series of censuses of the population in various districts, censuses that get the names and ages of every white and black inhabitant in these settled areas, and every person capable of bearing arms. And that young lawyer, semi-lawyer, who grew up next to Thomas Jefferson, And others also kind of see this as a moment to seize the opportunity for social betterment. In the wake of Lexington and Concord, Clark writes a letter to the committee, quote, offering myself as a candidate for the captaincy of the German company to be raised in the county. And this would have been seen by many kind of up-and-coming men like Clark as an opportunity to gain military glory, which then would add to kind of social prestige. And the example, even especially for Virginians to look at here was George Washington, who came up kind of middling, couldn't afford a college education, not suffering by any means, but then through service in the French and Indian War and the Virginia militia, made his fortune, along with a good marriage. So there's this kind of scrambling for military positions, for military recruits. There's also an assessment of threats by local sympathizers with the crown. And in Tryon County, the main one here was a guy by the name of Colonel John Johnson. And the colonel here is honorific. He was the colonel of a local militia county and the richest man in the county, but he wasn't actually kind of a military man himself. Still, he lived at a large estate called Johnson Hall, and his father had been kind of a informal ambassador for the British with the Iroquois nation. And the committee reported that Colonel Johnson has had a part of his regiment of militia under arms yesterday. This is mid-May of 1775. No doubt with a design to prevent the Friends of Liberty from publishing their attachment to the cause to the world. So for suppressing these committees and these kind of revolutionary organizations. The committee goes on, besides which we are told there are about 150 Highlanders, Scottish Highlanders. In parentheses, they were Roman Catholics, and this is an era in which kind of there's a lot of anti-Catholic bias, so this would have scared a lot of colonists from Protestant dissenting and other faiths. In and about Johnstown, the town near his estate, these are armed and ready to march upon like occasions. So it's saying that these loyalists are already arming up for a conflict, and then goes on to authorize the gathering of gunpowder, weapons, and appointing officers for military companies from the 5 districts of the county. The county also begins to engage in informal diplomacy with nearby Mohawk Indians in order to kind of gauge how they're going to fall in this conflict. And finally, in a sense, to kind of the perceived threats by these bodies, they order that, quote, every owner of slaves and servants do not permit them to absent themselves from home either by night or day. And there's this assumption that blacks and indentured servants are potentially a threat to these committees. And it says that, or else they'll be deemed enemies to the district and their county. So they're very much concerned with threats of loyalists, Native Americans, blacks. We also see these strictures against the enslaved in North Carolina and South Carolina and other counties in Virginia. Dunmore County doesn't seem to have a lot because there were only about half a dozen enslaved people there, at least in these censuses. But there is this kind of threat of kind of insurrection by people below white settlers as well as from loyalists. And as a result of this, in addition to military preparations, these committees consolidate their authority by repression, by considering and judging and sometimes punishing people reported to be disloyal to the committee's rule, to have disparaged the Congress or the revolutionary cause, or simply kind of are still loyal to the crown. And remember, this is more remarkable in that there isn't an alternative to the crown, and that this is a period where all of the members of the Continental Congress, all of the members of the provincial assemblies and provincial conventions, even if they are plotting rebellion, are opening every single document they write with we, the loyal subjects of George III in North America, do X, Y, Z. So they're still claiming loyalty to the crown, even if their actions are rebelling against it. But at the committee levels, kind of any reference to the king gets tarred as an opponent of the new established order. And there's a couple of reasons for this I'm happy to go into in the Q&A. But to give a couple examples, in Tryon County, by the summer of 1775, the local sheriff, the committee gets reports that he's running his mouth about the illegality of the committee. The sheriff, quote, one deponent says, quote, he heard the sheriff say oftentimes that he would fight for his king and his country, and that he hopes to have the pleasure of hanging a good many yet for their resistance against the acts of Parliament. And as a result, a month or two later, the committee actually displaces the sheriff and elects a new sheriff in his place, despite the fact that the committee has no authority to do this. Sheriffs are appointed by royal governors and ultimately hold king's commissions. There's also threats by loyalists attempting to kind of rally Indians against the revolutionary cause. And this is something that's throughout the revolution, kind of this fear of Indian violence. A farmer named Louis Clement, after being displaced from his land by a revolutionary family, a local rivalry it seems like, says to a neighbor, quote, I shall soon make up a good number of Indians and return with them and destroy and ruin such people that are all here about. For this, he's arrested by the committee, held for about 3 months without trial, tried by the committee, and again, by this kind of commission of about a dozen revolutionaries, and then sent to a jail at Albany, along with another person named Peter Brown, who was found, quote, guilty of the crime of inimical acts and deeds against the American cause. So again, the vagueness here suggests that these people know that they're not on sound legal footing, but that they recognize the necessity to eliminate these threats to their power and to the revolutionary movement. And then in Dunmore County, a William Clark, who's I don't think is a relative of Jonathan Clark, but I could be wrong, who's suspected of disrespecting the committee, writes in response to a summons from them that, quote, so long as you remain refractory and yield no submission to the mandates of the king, I shall pay no obedience to the summons of an illegal assembly. It says, basically sawed off. A week or two later, though, he changes his tune. And again, although the minutes don't exactly say what happens, his next statement is telling. He says, I, William Clark, of the said county, do declare that from henceforth I will not either publicly or privately hold any correspondence with any person who should speak disrespectfully of the Continental Congress or any committee of any county or their proceedings, and I hereby justify or declare that the Americans are justly entitled to those privileges for which they are contending, and further, this is where it gets interesting, that I will depart to the town of Woodstock within 10 minutes from this time, and that from the county of Dunmore before tomorrow night, and not return therein for the space of 1 year. So it's clear what's happened here. He's either kind of been tricked or intimidated or even arrested by the committee and forced to kind of recant his previous statement. And then, he's exiled. And I especially think, the 10 minutes from this time is especially telling, right? And he's only given about 24 hours to leave the entire county. So we get the exiling of many of these folks deemed inimical to Americans. And the biggest example of this is in Lancaster County. And again, I have the most extensive records for this, so it's not to say this stuff didn't occur elsewhere, but in Lancaster you can kind of see the progression of this. In June of 75, the committee passes an order compelling all adult males in the county to arm themselves and join a volunteer company. People who refuse are to be fined £3 10 shillings, which was a couple months' wages for your average laborer. By early August, those who continued to refuse were to be publicly labeled, quote, non-associators, and their names published in local newspapers and printed up on broadsides at local meeting places as a method of shaming them. And then by November, the committee is forcing artisans, forcing gunsmiths to work at subpar prices and to essentially donate their labor and their products to the war effort. First, they give them each a quota of weapons to make for the volunteer companies to be sold at, quote, Philadelphia prices of the previous year, so at a loss, essentially. Barred them from conducting any commerce, or more likely barred anyone else from buying from them before they had completed their allotment. And then threatened that if they didn't comply, they would be labeled enemies of the country and that their tools would be impounded, so essentially stripping them of their livelihoods and their reputations if they didn't go along. And as Lancaster County shows, in some cases, this repression against loyalists, against nonconformists, sparked infighting even within the revolutionary movement. And this is an equally important part of the story because it shows kind of why these committees end up favoring a stronger state and national government, almost counterintuitively. So one more example here in Lancaster County. In the summer of 1775, during this, what historian Charles Royster has called a rage militaire, this outpouring of military enthusiasm for the revolutionary cause, many overzealous recruiters made efforts to coerce the pacifist Moravians and Mennonites and other kind of German sects in the county into volunteering for the militia. By the end of May, so only a month and a half after the outbreak of the war, the county committee is receiving regular reports that, quote, persons whose religious tenets forbid them from joining military associations have been maltreated and threatened by some violent and ill-disposed people. And some of those people probably sat on that committee. But disdaining these methods, the majority of the committee resolves to, quote, use every possible means to discourage and prevent such licentious proceedings, issues orders for the striking off of a broadside, a kind of poster, in both English and German, urging, quote, harmony and unity, and promising that the committee would, quote, find means to bring all such imprudent persons to a proper sense of their misconduct. So saying kind of lay off these dissenting Germans. 4 days later, though, there's a popular backlash to this move. And all 11 members of the county committee who were present at the meeting where they issued these handbills are forced to resign. And again, the exact situation of events is unclear, but the committee cites, quote, the situation with regard to the inhabitants of the borough of Lancaster, and admits that, quote, their well-meant endeavors to serve the public good have not proved satisfactory to diverse people. So essentially the townspeople came out and said, you guys can't do this. We have to kind of go and recruit dissenters. There's this kind of backlash by more radical people. And then frustratingly, this is obscured in the records, but from looking around at other aspects, it's quite clear why this happened. And the composition of the committee that replaces them hammers this home even more. Whereas the prior committee had been about a dozen members, mostly from the town of Lancaster, mostly, again, not of the highest of the elite, but of these kind of local elite, local worthies. The new county committee is much more diverse, mostly hailing from smaller, more remote towns and villages, and numbering larger. It's 40 people, so it's replaced by this larger, kind of more small d democratic body. In place of the septuagenarian Edward Shippen III, the newly constituted group elects James Byrd, a Pennsylvania militia colonel who had risen from poverty, seen extensive combat on the Pennsylvania frontier during and after the 7 Years' War, French and Indian War for its North American theater. And even though, he's related to Shippen by marriage, these aren't strangers or even enemies, he's a very different kind of leader. He's a military man, and he hails, importantly, from the town of Paxton. And I mentioned at the top of the talk, Paxton is a township at the center of a violent vigilante movement in the 1760s, that in the wake of Pontiac's War in 1763, which was a conflict between Native Americans and settlers, these people murdered 20 peaceful Conestoga Indians, even kind of violating Pennsylvania and Lancaster law to do so. And what they do is they attack the Conestoga's village, where they find only about 6 people because the rest are out hunting and working. They murder those 6 people, The other 14 or 15 find solace in the jail in the town of Lancaster, where they're protected by the local authorities. The Paxton Boys, this militia from around that town, marches on Lancaster, breaks into the jail, and murders them all. Not satisfied with that, this militia gathers more support from the region, and in early 1764 actually marches on Philadelphia, and it's only kind of turned away by a desperate delegation from the Pennsylvania Assembly, led by Benjamin Franklin, who convinces them to go home. And although James Byrd is not involved in the Conestoga or the Paxton Boys massacre, he was stationed near modern-day Pittsburgh at the time, his committee, the Paxton Committee, already clashed with the county's revolutionary leadership. Early in the summer of 1775, they demanded access to the guns and gunpowder being held under lock and key by the committee, and were refused by the committee, worried kind of what they would do with the guns. After all, these are kind of proverbial rednecks and Indian haters who might go on and do anything, at least in the perspective of people like Edward Shippen III. But after kind of the dissolution of this first committee, these are the people who come to power, and it's this kind of give and take that makes these committees really interesting and really unique. So, and I'm going to kind of conclude here because I want to have time for questions. I think I've already gone a little bit longer than Tom and Heath wanted me to, so I thank you for your indulgence. But this idea that these popular revolutionary governments, it became more and more apparent by the end of 1775, beginning of 1776, that even if they could maintain control of their communities, it was at increasing costs. There were issues of who was supposed to pay for everything, how these authorities were supposed to be divided, where exactly orders were supposed to come from. And you see kind of in the minutes and in the letters of these people that into the fall and winter of 75, early 76, there's a lot more resistance to these bodies. They start kind of getting a little, and that's also kind of part of this repression narrative as well. But this doesn't sour these committee men on the American cause. These people don't go and become loyalists. They don't abandon the revolution. And in fact, even in Lancaster County, even what seems to be kind of a coup against the old committee, most of those 11 people who resigned are back on the committee within a few weeks, just in addition to these other 40 people. So there's this recognition that kind of, all of these people are needed in the kind of revolutionary coalition. But rather it demonstrated for these people the need for a new source of legal and political legitimacy, and one that did not depend on kind of ad hoc or arbitrary force. And so I'll leave you with one incident that took place in the early summer of 1776, and it's a conference of representatives from all of Pennsylvania's county committees. And they're meeting to kind of coordinate military mobilization and recruiting throughout the committees, but they're meeting right next door to the Pennsylvania Assembly. And this is kind of, I think, late May, early June of 76. And the Pennsylvania Assembly is debating whether or not to instruct its delegates to the Continental Congress, meeting, again, this is all within, maybe a mile of itself in downtown Philadelphia. The Pennsylvania Assembly is meeting to decide whether to instruct its delegates to the Continental Congress to vote for national independence. And Pennsylvania and New York are kind of the last two holdouts for independence, which it's been decided to be a unanimous decision. And as the Assembly is meeting, the committee gets word that they might not authorize independence, and the committeemen actually enter the Pennsylvania Assembly's meeting room and forcibly dissolve the Pennsylvania Assembly, and they issue their own instructions to the Continental Congress representatives based on their own authority as the kind of elected and unelected leaders of their communities to support independence. And this kind of there's a little more kind of legal nuance to this. The assembly reconvenes and says, basically, we're going to do what the committee says because they have guns. But they end up instructing their delegates to vote for independence. And so these committees ultimately play a crucial role in pushing their leaders for these kind of governments, these kind of governmental structures, this legal authority that ultimately, by the end of 76, beginning of 77, makes their positions and their authority obsolete. And we see kind of a decline in this local control as these people kind of go back to just being local worthies, local elites, and they end up, and it's been kind of fun tracing a lot of these people through their revolutionary careers, they end up as officers and enlisted men in the Continental Army and local militias. They end up as, some of them at the high level, delegates to colonial or state legislatures. A lot of them end up as large kind of land speculators and things like that. They go on to have distinct careers kind of outside of this power. So it's not a power grab. It's this kind of giving up of power in order to sustain the revolutionary cause and create stability within their communities. So I think I've held your attention long enough. Happy to answer questions or whatnot as you see fit, and kind of eager to hear responses. Yeah, Dennis.
Thank you for a really interesting talk. I think that has a connection to today's political sphere.
Absolutely.
But my question is, you addressed a little bit of it already, which is, what was the education level of these folks?
It varies widely. So, I mean, some of these guys, like Edward Shippen III, is classically trained lawyer, judge. I think he actually, I can't remember if he trains in Philadelphia or if he actually goes to London and trains at the Inns of Court. I think maybe the latter. But he's an outlier. Most of these folks are, again, they're not uneducated. They're country lawyers, they're merchants, they're farmers who are very capable of speculating in large amounts of land and kind of dealing in large amounts of crops and financial things. But I'd say it's middling, right? Very few of these people have been to a formal college. Most of them kind of county schools or tutors if their families could afford them. Most of them are kind of a smattering. What we might think of as kind of your 8th grade education, with the exception of kind of these professional people like the lawyers, the doctors, the judges, who obviously have a little bit more. But some of them, like Jonathan Clark, even he doesn't. His legal experience is that at the age of 14, he became clerk to the court of Albemarle County and kind of learned the law through observation and apprenticeship. So yeah, I mean, most of these, it's and the artisans are all kind of vocational apprenticeship learned. So it's kind of a step below what you would expect from kind of your state legislatures, your continental congressmen. But it's also, and crucially, and I think this is kind of the, and if I can go historiographical for a bit, this is kind of why we don't see these people, is because they're not, people either want to study the elites, the people who wrote great ideological things and flowery language, or they want to study kind of quote unquote the people, the subaltern, the working class, not a working class in the 18th century, but you get the idea. And these are the people kind of in between. They're the people who, some of them, if they had another 40 years to climb the ladder, they might have ended up in legislatures or in high office. Others are, these kind of third-rate country lawyers, these local physicians who are content to just, have their practices and live out their life in kind of relative comfort. These are kind of, in France they might, and again, I'm not a Marxist, but, they might call these the petite bourgeoisie, these kind of, middling sorts that we don't know a lot about, to be honest. Yeah, Sean.
I want to ask more about the sort of disappearance from this class from our histories, right?
Yeah.
So, I had, this is news to me, this the whole history, is it the case that in the historiography of the Revolutionary period that the story never gets told, or do you see it kind of get written out? Does that make sense?
Yeah, I've been finding this actually as I researched, and one of the nice things about COVID is it forced me to kind of traditional research methods, and I started looking on Google Books and for these things. And Google Books, for those who aren't aware, has almost everything that's out of copyright so from like 1923 and before, not everything, but a lot of things that were published and held in large libraries, which they paid people subpar wages to go digitize, which is not okay, but we can talk about that later. We are in a bookstore, so I should say that. But a lot of these committees and these are covered in local histories from the late 19th century. So there's a lot of interest, it seems to be, of these folks in like the 1870s, 1880s, 1890s, around the turn of the 20th century. And there's a couple of reasons why I think it's one is it's the rise of kind of these heritage organizations like the DAR, the Sons of the American Revolution, and people are kind of trying to trace their ancestry, and a lot of times, these are the people that get traced to. Another is kind of nativism and kind of the need to kind of prove that like this county participated in the formation of the country, so we're not like these kind of new places that are full of quote unquote unwanted immigrants that are coming in the 1870s, 1880s. But there's a lot of interest in it then, but it's mostly kind of at that local level. The historical profession as a whole, with a couple of exceptions, doesn't really seem to pick up on these folks really, until the last kind of 10 or 15 years, when there's been a little bit more about them, but still not kind of a systematic study of the sort that I'm trying to accomplish. Yeah, Amy.
Don, you mentioned that there is sufficient reason for committees not to keep records. So I wonder if I can ask you to speculate as to why these records exist at all. And especially in archives, if you happen to trace provenance, like who was, first of all, keeping these records and then preserving them on top of that.
So the Dunmore Count actually is one of the reasons I was really excited to find at the Virginia Historical Society, came with kind of a letter from the person who donated to the society, and it said that he actually found it in the attic of a descendant of one of these committee members. And so it was something that had been actually held on to by a participant until I think it was donated to the society in like 1900 or around then. And so that, a lot of it's kind of personal papers. Some of these are, and I suspect there's more to be found in state archives, and a lot of times they were donated to like the state legislatures under the new state constitutions when they're formed, kind of retroactively to be kind of like, okay, this is what we were doing during that period where we don't know a lot, and largely because people needed to trace deeds and land records and other legal stuff that happened in this period that's only in these committee minutes. But oftentimes it's weird because there's recalcitrance on the part of these archivists to find them. So the Lancaster Committee records, and it's one of the reasons that it's so complete and so great, is that Peter Force, and you know Peter Force probably, but he's this archivist in the 19th century, this historian in the 19th century who went out and tried to find all of the documents he could from the Revolutionary era in kind of all of these states. And he did this 1830s, 1840s, so not that in the living memory of the Revolution, but when it was becoming kind of historicized for the first time. And he sends, and he's a rich guy with things on his mind, so a lot of times he's sending people to these archives to transcribe for him. And he sends an assistant to Lancaster County to track down this committee meeting, and he says, well, I went to the archives, they said they don't have it. Then I went to the house of somebody who used to work at the archives, and he said, oh, they definitely have it. And then I went back and told them where he thought it was, and they said, oh yeah, we have it, but like we don't want to show it to you. And then it was like, and then it was this long convoluted story. So it's this kind of idea that even by like the 1840s and when he's looking around, they don't want like kind of some of this illiberalism, some of these repressive tactics, some of what went on in these committees kind of getting out into the main narrative. And so it's really interesting to kind of see. The Trial and County Committee, though, was published like in the early 20th century. And yeah, a lot of these kind of the other source of these is kind of these old historical magazines, like the South Carolina Historical Magazine, the Virginia Magazine of History and Biography, Pennsylvania Historical Magazine, these, which kind of publish these sometimes serially in the 1890s through about 1930, when they kind of stopped doing that. So yeah, I mean, it's interesting. Like I initially thought it would be like a lot more manuscript, but it's been a lot of kind of reading through these old, but then again, you also have to take that with a bit of thing like, what are they redacting when they're publishing these, right? So, is there more there? And I haven't yet found kind of a smoking gun about that yet.
Yeah,
So,
neat.
yeah, Bruce, and he.
So tell us what you see as parallels to our own time, and particularly taken by your remark that you're noting that the Philadelphia legislature changed its mind when the committee showed up.
Yeah, well, I think it's
guns, and so I'm thinking of sovereign sheriffs in our own time and the proponents of the Second Amendment. And there was no Second Amendment at the time you're talking about.
Yeah, I think, and I hesitate, to draw too much kind of parallel. But, I think there's a reason, and they obviously didn't, weren't thinking this themselves, but I think that there's a reason that these people who stormed the Capitol on January 6th, they're saying 1776, this is the revolution. I think it's this popular aspect to the revolutionary experience that's been kind of underplayed, again, so as not to kind of give credence to the idea that this too is kind of part of the revolutionary heritage. So I think you can see it in kind of these private militia companies throughout the country. You can see it in kind of on both sides of the political equation, and kind of the organizing kind of in the summer of 2020 for or against racial justice, depending on which side you are on. I think both of these are popular movements that are using violence and intimidation to further their goals. I will say, just on my own opinion, I think one of them is using violence a lot more than the other. But it is this kind of populist or popular heritage that has a long legacy, and I think it does. You can, and another be a fascinating project, but I think you can kind of trace a through line through American history, and I think there is kind of a memory of these committees who are themselves, I should mention, also drawing on a memory of a kind of popular politics at the end of the 17th century in England's Glorious Revolution. The term Committee of Safety itself, in the way that they're using it, stems out of the English Civil War. And actually, I think stems out of a particular reading of the English Civil War that was popular in North America at that time. But you can see this kind of throughout the Revolution. Anywhere from the revolt of the Pennsylvania Line in 1781, this kind of mutiny that almost destroyed the Continental Congress, to the establishment of kind of Shays' Rebellion in 86, through the establishment of Democratic Republican clubs in the 1790s, and the Jeffersonian movement in the 1800s. I think there's kind of a through line here that, for whatever reason, hasn't been, a couple of reasons, but hasn't been picked up on, in a lot of historical record. Yeah.
To what extent were, especially with the local nature of these county committees, to what extent were they just leveraged for petty score settling?
That's really hard to. Yeah. It's really hard to determine, right? And it does seem, and there's been some good studies on this in the last 10 years, that in a lot of places, the families that end up being loyalists, the families that end up being patriots, already hated each other long before the revolution, right? I mean, the classic example of this is the Delanceys and the Livingstons in New York, who were the two most powerful members of the New York gentry. The Livingstons end up patriot, the Delanceys end up Tory, and largely it's there's this much difference between their political ideologies in 1770. It's just that that Livingstons are patriots and we're going to have to side with the king. So it's really hard to tell. I suspect it's more so in more settled regions or more European settled regions where there is a longer history. What I'm finding, especially in these frontier counties, these situations like Tryon County, for example, is a lot of these people just got there 10 years ago, and there hasn't been time to kind of build big rivalries. Their main rivalries are between kind of the legislatures at Albany or New York City, rather than within their local community, or with kind of Sir William Johnson, who's this grand poobah Indian trader. But there are, there's evidence, right, in especially in Lancaster County, that there are kind of these petty personal rivalries that are at play, it's something that I need to explore a little bit more. It's hard to say though, like, because at what point, like, at some points, people like who are for petty reason, like annoyed about being left off of the committee, go and end up defecting to the king. So it's like, at what point, like, is it a political difference or is it a personal difference, or are they kind of intermingling? Yeah.
I have a kind of related question. Just looking at the different groups on your key there, like Scotch-Irish, I'm thinking, given Scottish nationalism and Irish nationalism, maybe they were already like, who cares about the British king? Like, of course we're in with it. And the Germans, like, why would they be loyal to the British crown? And so I'm wondering how much those kind of identities that they came to the U.S. with may have influenced.
Yeah, it's a good question. Because on the one hand, there is this idea that, especially Scots-Irish, and there are a fair amount of kind of Irish, the folks around. There's this idea that, these are already dissenters, right? And certainly that's what the English thought. The English look at, like, the New England revolutionaries especially, and they say, okay, these guys were, separatists from the founding of Plymouth, right, in 1620. Like, they were trying to get away from England. They thought they were better than us. They want to be different than us, which isn't entirely untrue, right? It's part of the culture of these communities. But there's also, it's more, for a lot of these folks, I think it's more mundane than that. They're worried about violence. They're worried about the coherence of their communities. And oftentimes you see kind of, as many of the ones that you see of like William Clark, who gets thrown out of Dunmore County and has 10 minutes to leave the room, you also see people kind of earnestly accepting these revolutionary regimes. Like people who, there's dozens of accounts of, like, and this is how petty it gets, people like reporting to the committee, so-and-so was drinking in the tavern and he said, damn that Congress. And then they bring him before the committee and he's like, oh, I didn't mean damn that Congress. I love the Congress. What are you talking about? So like it seems, that there's this kind of peer pressure going on, this kind of need to sustain the coherence of these communities. And I think that as the further west you get, kind of the more important that is, that kind of community solidarity in underpopulated areas. The other thing is I would say that a lot of these, the Scots-Irish are a special case, right? But a lot of these people aren't that dissatisfied with the deal they've got as non-English people in British colonies, and especially like the Germans, right? A lot of the Germans come from the Palatinate, come from areas in central and western Germany that have been destroyed by, a century of warfare between different great powers in Europe. They're in a place where they can actually live in peace and farm and prosper. A lot of these folks are kind of, in Pennsylvania, are religious dissenters who are persecuted for their beliefs and forced into the Austrian or the Prussian or the French army by kind of these various powers. And at least in Pennsylvania, the on paper, they don't have to, go out and do any of this stuff. So a lot of these people, I feel like without the provocations of Lexington and Concord and these kind of violations of the perceived rights of British subjects, they're pretty happy with Britain. And I mean, one of the big population groups that ends up fighting for the crown are actually Scottish Highlanders, like Catholic Scots, who are in the colonies, and it's largely because they're grateful to the king for kind of giving them these opportunities. All right.
All right, I think we'll
Oh, good.
conclude. Thank you very
Okay.
much.
Yeah.